Hello and welcome to the Lifting the Iceberg podcast. My name is Tyler James Berger, and I'm so excited to be releasing this episode with Professor Kareem Johnson. Kareem Johnson is a professor of psychology at Temple University, whose expertise, among others, is evolutionary psychology, but more specifically, what he calls quantum evolutionary psychology, which is the name of the capstone class of his that I took before I graduated at Temple, where I did my thesis on the influence that altered states of consciousness had on the emergence of art. His course is one of the most important ones I've ever taken, and it greatly influenced my focus for this podcast. It was an honor to have him on, and I know you guys will love it as much as I did. So, without any further ado, please welcome Professor Kareem Johnson. So I'm sitting here with Professor Kareem Johnson. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really interested in talking to you about the evolution of religion.
Sure thing.
And then moving on to a broader discussion on the seeming coevolution of religion and art. So my first question is, from the evolutionary perspective, what is religion? How do you understand and look at the phenomenon of religious practice?
So trying to define religion is still a tricky thing that I don't know if there is a universal definition. But one of the things that we sort of typically agree that religion is a kind of set of symbolic, a collection of symbolic beliefs that people use to explain the world around them, and what I would also include is ways of interacting with each other. And so, within religions, there are often ways that we are supposed to interact with these unseen elements, right? Whether we call them gods or angels or spirits or ancestors, but also rules for how we're supposed to interact with each other. And so that's kind of moral principles. Also, there, with many religions, there is teachings that are built into how to survive in the environment. So that could include things like, when to farm, what foods to eat, ways to clean. And so religion is a sort of collection of beliefs that get passed down from generation to generation that both contain rules for how we're supposed to act towards each other, the ways that we're supposed to act towards the world, and ways that we're supposed to act in connection with these unseen forces. Now, of course, the question is, why is there this universal belief in these unseen forces? Is that something that's really necessary or not? Because you could, just point out the fact that there are thousands and thousands of religions that have, been on this planet. All of them seem to suggest that there's something true or sacred in their teachings, but that can't logically be true that all of them are true. And so why have this need for these kind of supernatural unseen elements? And that's the sort of the kind of larger question. I could go ahead and attempt to give you some theories as to why I think that might be the case.
For sure.
Well, part of it, I think, is just kind of a natural need to explain things. And the way that we explain things are with templates that we have already built understanding for. And so our ability to understand these unseen forces is really kind of hard. The scale for a normal human being just on the planet, you can't see the whole big picture. What you can see are examples of creation, examples of influence that is human. We understand that I as a human being can build. I as a human being can create, can influence. And so if we see examples of creation or we see examples of influence like weather or day goes to night, it's very easy to humanize or anthropomorphize those sorts of influences. It's got to be something like a person in order to have this influence on the world that we see around us at such big scales. And so I think it's, sorry. Oh yeah.
So, I was just going to say, so religion seems to be a way for people to deal with mystery, to deal with the unknown, and kind of map onto the unknown, map onto the cosmos, their own mythology that can serve as a map for navigating that territory.
It's very similar to when I think about this too, the discovery of the black hole.
Mm-hmm.
So just a little science tidbit. You cannot see a black hole. What you can see, however, is how the black hole, this blackness, this nothingness, influences the objects around it.
Yeah.
And so only through the way that other things act to this unseen force do you know there must be a force there. With the things that we see in life, again, weather, sunrise, sunset, we can't see the thing that causes those things to happen, but we know things are happening. We know changes are occurring, and so there must be some unseen force that causes those kinds of things. And so it seems a natural kind of fact of being a human being with the ability to formulate cause and effect relationships, to hypothesize possibilities, to say that, well, I see these things changing, therefore there must be some force, some cause to it. I just can't see it. But if it can do it, then it must have, again, a sort of human interpretation. It must have some kind of will.
Yeah.
Must be some representation of will, because anytime I see sort of change and creation on this planet, it also seems to be an example of will coming from human beings or even other animals.
Yeah, for sure. Now, you seem to be talking about religion in a way where it serves an adaptive advantage. Obviously, we don't want to live as human beings living in nature. We don't want to live surrounded by chaos.
Sure.
We want to try to make known out of the unknown, so we can live in ordered, known territory that we can feel secure in. So it seems that religion, what we even have now, could be construed as a religion in terms of like the modern zeitgeist and scientific beliefs, because it's a way of understanding reality and understanding the unknown. So do you think that the human propensity or proclivity towards religion serves this adaptive advantage? Or do you perceive religion as more of a byproduct, a spandrel of evolution?
To religion as a spandrel. So I do think there is an adaptive advantage to having an ability to explain causal relationships that you observe. Right? This would be one of the theories for why do human beings have consciousness in the way that we do, right? And so, for instance, if I am an ant, we might propose that an ant isn't conscious in the way that we are, but it can survive perfectly well in its environments with instinctual kinds of programming. Us as human beings, we do a lot of thinking, and we make these intentional sort of actions or create these views of the world that we use to try to explain why things happen. And this need for us to explain why things happen and how things work is a huge advantage, right? It is that ability that lets you build a bow and arrow to understand, with this tight string, I can shoot this little stick and put a pointy thing on it that can actually pierce something. That kind of cause and effect understanding of the world, I think, is really the big human advantage. But when you have the ability to start looking for cause and effect and start asking what if, that same ability for you to say, if I took this string and made it tight, I could launch this arrow, is the same thing. Makes you wonder, how am I here in the first place? How did I get here? Everything I've seen that has gotten here was born from something else. Therefore, I must have been born from something else. This world must have been born from something else. And so then a kind of natural extension of your ability as a human being to think abstractly, to make causal relationships, then leads you to question, what was the cause of me? What was the cause of this larger world that I inhabit? And I think going to kind of a larger idea of where we must come from seems to be kind of a natural, almost logical extension of your ability to build tools and predict, that if the sun went up tomorrow, it's going to go up the next day.
Yeah, for sure. But it seems that this thing that we do where we analyze cause and effect, it can go astray and kind of break. And an example I'll give is I was just with my friend the other night who is from Peru, and I was talking to him about Peruvian shamanism, and he said that his father had an experience with a quote-unquote shaman in Peru who one of the practices that this shaman did to this guy's father, which kind of put him off of the whole shamanism thing, she took a guinea pig and rubbed the guinea pig all over his body and then cut its stomach open and let all the organs fall onto the floor. And then she would read his future in the positioning of reading entrails and scrying into that. And that seems too far.
Sure.
You know, that's this proclivity to see cause and effect
where there is no cause
where there
and effect.
is no
Yes.
cause and effect.
Yes,
and
right.
I think that's where religion becomes exaptive.
Sure.
That's where it becomes something that is just a problematic vestige.
So the ability to see cause and effect does not mean that you see it correctly.
Yeah.
Right. And so
Yeah.
this is one of the issues that we have.
Creating cause and effect.
Yeah, is that we can see relationships that aren't in fact true. You know, in psychology, we call these illusory correlations, and they abound. You know, and many of these get built into our pop culture, like the idea that people with arthritis have their arthritis symptoms change depending on bad weather, which is totally untrue.
Yeah.
Proven the relationship between full moon nights and people acting, in a crazier way, where we get the word lunatic. These things are also untrue. But it is easy for us as human beings to see connections, even if they aren't any connections there. The bias is to see a pattern and make a connection, whether or not that pattern is true or not. But there are, so the bigger question is, so then how can it be adaptive if the cause and effect relationships aren't accurate?
Yeah.
And so this is where we get into more larger group phenomena. That it may be one person with totally irrational ideas of cause and effect. Religion would be maladaptive. But the thing about religions is that we build into them lots of useful knowledge. They are a combination of truth and not truths, right? It is true that in a ancestral environment, it is not smart to eat raw pork. In comparison to raw beef or some other foods. And so
because pigs dig up roots and have a lot of parasites.
Because of the particular kinds of parasites that you're more likely to have within the food. And so you could build around a belief system that says pork is an unclean food that's tied to real biological cause, even if the true understanding of that cause isn't correct. Another sort of quick medical example. It was when doctors started delivering babies that women started dying during birth, because when it was kind of traditional medicine, they had these beliefs about dirty spirits, unclean spirits, and so would do things like wash their hands if they were touching dead bodies. Doctors, when they were early practicing, would go and do an autopsy and then go deliver a baby and then be surprised when the mother fell ill. Well, they had carried these germs, but they had no scientific idea of germs at the time. But the ancient beliefs, or the more traditional cultures, had a non-scientific belief of bad spirits,
which could have just been their best attempt at understanding the phenomenon that they were seeing.
Exactly. And so, for an ancestral human being, the notion of tiny bacteria and viruses is not something that's really within the scope of your imagination, but something like bad spirits is. And it doesn't take a whole lot. Hey, if we touch dead bodies and then we touch somebody else, they get sick. Well, we can say, well, you're taking pathogens from, the dead body and giving it to someone, and that's, causing that illness. But the idea of bad spirits is good enough. It's a heuristic. It's a mental shortcut that actually solves lots of larger problems, even if the fundamental cause and effect relationship isn't true.
But sometimes these religions can hit the nail on the head when it comes to certain things. And I think that in terms of religion being a way of, you're going to say, yeah.
So the details don't have to be right. The details don't have to be right as long as the outcomes are what you want.
As long as the behaviors become evolutionarily advantageous.
Exactly. So Darwin didn't understand genes when he came up with his theory of evolution, but what he had was a series of observations that he could then put into a larger framework to make sense of what he was seeing. Now, the true underlying cause is something else, but what he could gather from observation alone was a set of rules that he said, well, this must make sense. Right? These things must go together. ancient peoples, without knowledge of genes, without the knowledge of bacteria, can still see, hey, certain things go together. Certain plants are more useful when we have these kinds of illnesses. Don't touch a dead body and then give birth because that causes bad effects. Don't eat these foods that are raw, but maybe these foods that are raw are okay. Don't wash with this hand after you just cleaned yourself with the same hand. And so you can observe patterns. Sometimes the reason, again, not understanding germs, you might understand, well, maybe I shouldn't wash myself and then eat with that same hand, but you might understand dirty versus clean. And that's enough to lead to an outcome that's a healthier group, the one that avoids eating certain foods, has certain kinds of cleansing rituals in comparison to another group that doesn't have those same rituals.
And in that way, the religious cause and effect correlation, the connection can be advantageous.
Yeah, in essence, you have built in one group a set of beliefs that by following them, whether the underlying cause is right or wrong, leads to a better outcome for that group. And that could be food practices. It could also be moral practices, right? Something, I am not a big supporter of draconian morality, but even something like marriage laws, right? That we want to encourage people to get married before they have kids, right? Well, you could see how that could be a stabilizing force in a group of early human beings when
there was no birth control pill.
Taking care of babies is a huge drain on resources. And so let's say you're not allowed to do this until you have set some kind of stable unit. And so that might involve discouraging sexual impulses in adolescents when they're young, and maybe coming up with some kind of punitive justification for it. But the ultimate goal is we don't want to have too many babies that we as a population can't sustain. So let's create stable units first before we encourage sexual behavior amongst you.
For sure. And something that I see religion being utilized for is, it seems like one of those unknowns that religion deals with, alongside of where did human beings come from, where are we going, what happens after we die. One of them is, how do we conduct ourselves throughout our lifetime? So religion is a way of mapping out the most optimal modes of being that increase a social organism's ability to move up and across dominance hierarchies. And what I mean by that is, so say that there are 10 males in a troop of chimpanzees. There is one way of being that brings that one male up to the top of the dominance hierarchy, which increases its sexual success. And then that mode of being, then you take 10 other groups of 10 chimpanzees and you extract from each one the mode of being that caused that chimpanzee to transcend the other 9 chimpanzees. And then you extract from that the behaviors common between all of those chimpanzees, and what you can abstract from that is akin to like a deity, and that's something that religious deities could represent, is the possible optimal mode of being that is the hero archetype, the mode of being that allows a human being to transcend the dominance hierarchy and increase its chance of reproductive success, because women, sexually selective women, as in like the human species, they are kind of letting men compete with each other and form themselves into dominance hierarchies to see who rises to the top, and then they're just skimming off the top because they're the men are in competition to prove their genetic prowess, so to speak. And a religious symbol, a Christ figure or a Buddha figure, can be the abstracted amalgam of the behaviors that most lead to rising in the social hierarchy to the point of an idolized maximize reproductive success. You know what I mean?
I could see how you could take what we might think of as a collection of virtuous behaviors or idealized behaviors and sort of ascribe them to a deity-like figure that then becomes kind of like an ideal for achievement, right? So this is the ideal that we as a sort of society view, see as important or value in kind of our ultimate member of our
and
group.
The more similar you are to that idea, the more likely you are to leave offspring.
I could see that as an idea. What I wouldn't see, however, is why that would be selective towards men, why you wouldn't see similar pressures for both men towards an ideal, and there should also be, I would think, a corresponding female ideal.
Well, women seem to be the selectors, they're the ones screening men. It's kind of like that Louis C.K. bit where he goes, more of me, and it's the woman's job to go, that's enough of you.
So this is true and not true when we talk about selection, right? So human beings are a little bit unusual in that both men and women are selectors. What we're choosing about is we're selecting on different criteria based on what we have to invest, right? So women are very selective in terms of who they are going to sexually get involved with, because the act of sex, again, if we think in an evolutionary environment, runs the big risk of pregnancy. And so there's a huge biological cost that it can cost a woman. And so they are much more selective in terms of who they choose as a mate for a male. Men are selective not in who they will have sex with, but who they will invest in. And so there is competition amongst women, not necessarily to be the mistress, but to be the wife, to be the one that's going to get the
center of
long-term
resources.
investment. And so when we think about women as the selectors, that is certainly true. But men are also selectors. It's just they're selecting on a different thing. So it's like, the dichotomy becomes the classic kind of Madonna whore dichotomy, right? Where men devalue women in a certain sense if they feel like it's too easy to access them sexually. And so, but men are much more stingy when it comes to who they're going to spend their money on, who they're really going to invest their time in. And so men are also doing a form of selection. And that's why we start to encourage things like chastity in women becomes a big theme in a lot of religions, because men are, in essence, pressuring women to be more like the version that they're going to invest themselves in.
Then why are most religious deities men?
Yeah. Well, so I think part of this is a historic, this is going to be more tied to monotheistic religions, right? Where there is one God, as opposed to polytheistic religions. In polytheistic religions, it tends to be both male and female goddesses. But if you have a one God model, a monotheistic model, then that is most typically portrayed as male. But it could also be because of these sort of other sort of general things in our human society that males are, by being a primary food provider in terms of hunting, because males are more centered around competition, whereas women in hunter-gatherer realm still is not as much competition based.
It's more like distribution of resources.
And so with males, there is a top male, and so when you start putting religion on top of it, then the top male wants to take that position. Why are there top males? Again, because you don't need a whole lot of males. Right? You need one really, and
competent male who can like provide and maximize the survival of the tribe, I guess you could say.
And so, males are much more selected on their sort of the process of competition with each other.
Yeah.
So, that kind of dominant hierarchy rankings.
Yeah. And religion, I think, scribes the ways in which like people move on up a hierarchy, whether it be a male hierarchy or a female hierarchy. And this is where I want to kind of bring in art, because art seems to be the human way of representing these deified ideals.
It's certainly one way.
So do you think that art and religion seem to have co-evolved. And so there's that like highly abstract cognized definition of a relation between art and religion that I just said. But something that I'm really interested in is the evolution of art as you look at prehistoric cave art. And because these are the first examples of art that we have, that our species have created. And you see in some of these caves...
that is, if you don't count all the bead jewelry and some of the like...
Oh, even older than that.
Figurines. The cave art is some of the earliest in terms of like, you know, what we might think of as equal to kind of like paintings.
Yeah.
But certainly when it comes to body...
Like
using the body as a canvas.
Who's
for
the
art.
Frozen caveman?
Utsi.
Yeah.
So, you know, Utsi had
tattoos. Yeah.
And necklaces, that little medicine pouch, all kinds of things.
For sure. But the large majority of the earliest art seems to have had some kind of sacred element to it. Something I was really interested in is in a lot of these caves, there's art in very hidden spots where only one person can fit, where they were not creating it for someone else to see, to put it on display, to put it in a quote unquote gallery, the cave gallery. They were finding some place to make art for themselves because they had this creative urge to externalize their imagination. And what do you think could be, to add on to that, something that I find really interesting is the connection between psychedelic experiences and early creation of art. And the psychedelic visionary experience is often accompanied by a creative urge. And it seems to be that the religious or mystical experience could have been the thing that influenced art, but then is that causal, or did our ability to create art elevate our ability to represent reality through stories? What do you think is the connection between religion and art when you look at the human evolutionary history?
Yeah, well, you know, we had a brief conversation before this, but I think, you know, these things are all coming online at the same time. It seems that, you know, one of the things that made our version of the Homo genus, different is our mastery of these kind of symbolic, you know, symbols. It's really symbols, and I think also a desire to share symbols. And so, you know, Neanderthals, one of the things that's really striking about them, they figured out how to make tools, but they made the same tools over and over and over again, never innovated. With human beings, once we started making tools, we started making better tools, and it seems like whatever thing made us need to keep making more and more better tools, it's coming along at the exact same time where we're starting to see representations in terms of art, cave paintings, again, bead necklaces, decoration, burial plots that now have symbolism to them, with arms folded facing certain directions, buried with flowers. All these things where it seems that we had this ability to try to find symbolic meanings that was more than just understanding the relationship with the physical objects that we can see, to more, again, abstract kinds of thoughts. But I think what makes art really compelling is that it seems that there's a need for us to communicate with it, to share it. I think part of this is a limitation of language, both with religion and art. You know, like, there are things that I can say to you in terms of words, but, you know, words aren't always good enough.
Art goes further than language.
Because sometimes what we want to communicate is a feeling. What we want to communicate is an experience. And do you know the term qualia? Are you familiar with this term, qualia?
Yeah. Could you explain it?
So the idea of qualia is that none of us can ever really know somebody else's experience of anything, right? Whether something like how you experience the color red, or even how the taste of sweet, you know, the taste of sugar tastes to you, right? I assume that sugar tastes to you the same way that it tastes to me. But for all I know, if I could be in your body and taste sugar, it would taste like a lemon
Mm-hmm.
in my mouth.
Yeah.
But what I would only be able to communicate with you is your visual expression of your facial. So if you smiled just like I smiled, if you use the same words as I use, right, I really can't have any idea of how you experience the world.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we are limited with language. We are limited with words. And I think with art, with a lot of these impulses is I want to share things that I don't have words for to explain. When we think about the idea of like the kind of cave representations of like, hallucinogenic kinds of experiences like spirals, squiggly lines, looks like some of the form concepts in hallucinations. I think what has to be going on there is early people's experimenting with psychedelics and wanting to share that experience. I am seeing things.
What is happening? Is this happening to you too?
Yes, I am seeing something and I want to communicate what I'm seeing with you. To you, but I cannot do it with words. You cannot be in my body. And the best way I can do this is to try to visually show you what I am seeing, because you can't be in my head and see through my own eyes.
So then that is the creative urge, the urge to show someone how you are experiencing reality.
And how you're experiencing something that you can't explain.
Yeah.
How do you explain those things with words? You
Yeah.
can't. It's like trying to tell someone you see television depictions of people being drunk or high. And until you get drunk or high, listeners, don't get drunk or high. But until you have those experiences, that's my public service announcement as a college professor. But until you experience it yourself, like watching other people, hearing about it, you don't know what it feels like until you've done it.
But sometimes, especially in these hallucinogenic experiences that people have, multiple people will have the same experience. People will experience therianthropes.
They'll use similar words and similar language to try to depict what they're seeing.
And that could seem to be proof enough for people to say that something exists. It's like, I see this table, you see this table, I can abstract from that this table exists.
Sure.
If you have a whole tribe of people taking ayahuasca and seeing a half jaguar, half man being come to you, then you could posit that as something that has some kind of external reality or existence.
So that's a possibility. The other possibility is that there is some similarity in the way that our bodies and brains react to these substances, that they may conjure forth similar kinds of feelings or similar kinds of sort of connections
that are innate to our biology.
That may be innate to our biology. It may be that the therianthropes, these kind of figures that people seem to agree upon, is actually a figure that is created through communication, right? I'm trying to explain to you what I'm seeing, and I'm giving you aspects, you're giving me aspects, and we're kind of creating a best collective representation of something that none of us can fully explain, but this is like the best that we can get with the language and the symbols that we have available to us. Right? I'm sure that in a let's say a tribal community where jaguars are a common visual animal that they see, then you're going to get those themes. I would guess that if you had someone who had never seen a jaguar before take the same drug, they may have aspects of human-like figures, not quite human, maybe something else. And so there may be these shared themes, but maybe not the exact the exact details of those shared figures.
Yeah, for sure.
One of my favorites is, some of the work that's been done with where you stimulate the temporal and parietal lobes.
The God helmet?
The God helmet, exactly. And so some people, for instance, will experience feeling disembodied and will interpret it as like an alien, lifting them out of their bodies. Others will have the exact same experience and see it as more religious. Others will see it as something that's kind of neither sci-fi or religious. And so I think there is a lot that our personal, the symbols, the imagery that we are carrying with us going into those experiences then shape the imagery that we have while having them.
Like probably one of the most well-known therianthropic deity is Horus, the Egyptian god of attention, and this is a half man, half hawk, and the reason, symbolically speaking, that it's represented with a hawk's head is because hawks have such pinpoint accurate sight, and it takes sight to pay attention, and attention is an aspect of your personality to deify because of its importance. If you don't pay attention, you're going to get eaten. You know, I've heard before is like a definition of nature is that thing that if you don't pay attention to it, it kills you. You know, so attention.
So is man.
Yeah.
So is man.
So pay attention. So there's the expression of the therianthropic form that has some kind of cultural connotation to its manifestation. And that's why I also think that art is the mechanism through which human beings transmit cultural information across generations. Why is it possible that we still have cultural elements from a bunch of dead guys who wrote a piece of paper in 1776? Because their lasting presence in what they left behind still gives us guidance into how we live our lives today. And a lot of that is through artistic expression.
Well, I mean, religion, you know, ancestrally does all the things that we want culture to do. It passes information from generation to generation, right? And because religion has built into it an element of the sacred, you are required in order to pass it on. You are required to take it seriously because it is sacred. But built into that sacred is how you should treat each other, how you should treat your environment, you know, rules that you need in order to survive. So the things that government does, the things that art do, in an ancestral environment, religion does both of those things for us. It tells us how to live. It tells us
the churches were the city halls.
Yeah. And so you get governance, you get education, and you get expression, all in all through religion. And so these, you know, I think it would be hard to have a human species that did not create religion. Even
without also having created art to go with it.
They're all aspects of, I think, our attempt to understand the world
and conduct ourselves,
and understand things that are larger than ourselves, that we will not have the language to fully comprehend. And so again, we build in understandings of the world that, you know, that are useful and adaptive, and we call them sacred, and we pass them on. And so we now know how to eat, we now know how to behave. One of the things that religions do is they get you to override self-interest. And if you want to have a successful group, giving a rationale for why I shouldn't take all the food, or why I shouldn't kill the guy that's a rival to me, these ways of overcoming some of the sort of selfish drives that we may have in order to maintain the group, because as social creatures we actually need the group. And so finding that tragedy of the commons, finding that balance between self-interest and group interest is another thing that religions help us do.
Now, one of the really interesting videos that you show in your class is a clip from Planet Earth of a tribe of chimpanzees like tearing apart another tribe. And the final clip is of one chimpanzee sharing the flesh of another chimpanzee to another one that's part of the tribe.
Part of my own group.
So in what way could that religion be a way of serving the group? In what way could those chimpanzees have manifest religious dynamics?
Well, so chimpanzees actually do show a bit of a religious phenomena in what's known as the endowment effect. Are you familiar with the endowment effect? So the endowment effect is, in essence, this. So have you ever had like a toy or a teddy bear or anything? It's like once it is yours, that particular one becomes special. And if I gave you the exact same teddy bear or toy, you don't want that one. Even if the new one is newer, there's something about your own. As if by having it in your possession, you have now endowed it with some special or unique property, right? It's not just the function of that object, and there's this extra thing you've added because it's yours. And chimpanzees actually show something similar, that two functionally equivalent objects, the one that was theirs is the more valuable object. What have you now given this thing or endowed it with? And so that some objects are more sacred than others simply by possessing them is something that chimpanzees show. In terms of your question about altruism, helping one another while also being capable of great violence against another group, it is sort of an interesting thing that's built into well-functioning social groups, is a willingness to share within the group, even if we are willing to, again, do great violence to them or the other group. If it's my group, something about being part of my group, you now have something special. I've now endowed you with something sacred simply because we have this shared identity as a group.
Yeah, and chimpanzees seem to not have any transmutable culture or any kind of art that enforces these behaviors, because I feel like even if they had like 0.5% of culture in 1,000,000 years, they would have a city, you know?
So there is a bit of chimpanzee culture in that there are regional differences in how you do things that do seem to get passed on. So, for instance, one of the famous discoveries of Jane Goodall was chimpanzees using sticks to pull out termites and eat them off the stick. You basically stick a stick in a termite hole, the termites crawl on the stick, you pull the stick out, and you lick the termites off the stick. But that's one troop of chimpanzees. Turns out that if you go a couple miles in another direction, there's chimpanzees that have learned to eat termites, but they have an entirely different way of doing it. Instead of sticking a stick in a hole, they use a bigger stick to dig it up. But in essence, if you're, let's say, East Side chimps, they do it.
East Side
chimps. West Side chimps have another way of doing it. And so within chimps on the East Side, they will pass down that knowledge of how to do it, whereas chimps on the West Side will pass down their own particular way of doing it.
So they have memes.
So yes, in some ways you could say there is kind of a set of memes, things that we imitate, and these behaviors that get imitated get passed on. And as you kind of think of it as a geographically isolated set of behaviors, right? On this side, this behavior gets imitated and repeated. On the other side, a different set of behaviors get repeated, even though they're separate behaviors meant to solve. And that's fundamentally the same problem: how to get more termites out of the hill.
For sure. And so you can have a meme without needing to represent it visually in culture.
Because a meme is any behavior or any basically social behavior that gets imitated. And so whether that's, wearing your clothes a certain way, or learning how to dig up termites a certain way, to even something like I actually showed this in a video in my course, or used to, how to drill a hole in a shell. That if you were to drill a hole, you would do it by twisting your hand left and right and kind of like trying to mimic something like a drill. But if you went to a hunter-gatherer tribes 10,000 years ago, this twisting notion that you would use to drill a hole isn't something that they would actually do. Instead, if they wanted a hole, they would use a sharp point and dig it out, scrape out a hole. And so that scraping behavior, and that you can tell by the way that the scratch marks are left, it actually took a long time to figure out, twist to drill as opposed to scrape out a hole.
Interesting. So the final question I want to ask you and talk with you about is the importance of the evolutionary perspective.
Sure.
And you teach a course at Temple called Quantum Evolutionary Psychology.
Yes, it's an intimidating name.
Yeah. But quantum, of course, means the bits and pieces of the entirety of human evolution. And it's we, through an evolutionary perspective, we're able to have a conversation on art and religion and reproductive success. Evolution seems to be just such a great overarching theory. What is it about evolution that you are so drawn to, and where is this perspective lacking in our society today?
I love evolutionary perspectives because they are clearly the explanation in that. And that, to me, because it's really about how things change over time. And it is one of the most obvious things to observe, that things change over time. Nothing is static. But within the way that things change, there are some similarities to how things work. Once you learn what a fractal is, how the patterns of how your joints go together, the golden ratio, or how you build the great example is a piece of broccoli. When you take a piece of broccoli, all those little buds, it's tiny little branches upon branches upon branches upon branches upon branches. If you take a branch, it looks like a tree. But kind of getting off topic. But why evolutionary perspective is because you really can understand everything in terms of an evolutionary
by seeing the same things manifest across all
at many different scales.
Yeah.
Exactly. Behavior is a great term because I can talk about how particles and an atom behave. I can talk about how people behave. I can talk about how tribes behave. I can talk about how cultures behave. I can talk about how the stock market behaves. That when you understand a term like behavior, how things act in accordance to the environment that they're in and the initial conditions that you started with, that same kind of language can be used for chemistry, for physics, for biology, for psychology, for the stock market, for shopping behavior, for everything. And so that's why I like the evolutionary perspective, because why are certain things in fashion right now? Well, in essence, that's natural selection. It is certain things
or sexual selection.
But the idea is selection, right? That all these possibilities are out there. Some are more popular than others. The ones that become more popular stick around and keep getting repeated. The ones that aren't so popular fade away.
Yeah.
Right. But sometimes just because it faded away right now doesn't mean that it's permanently out of the mix. And so if the environment changes, things that were not so successful can become successful again. But I just think once you understand an evolutionary perspective, you really can understand any other field. I was telling a friend of mine, once you understand evolution, like nothing will surprise you. Nothing is surprising. Everything makes sense. Some things may, be shocking. You might be caught off guard, but everything in retrospect makes sense
through this lens.
Through the lens, through the lens of evolution, right? To the, why I like certain foods, why I'm attracted to the people that I am. Many of the decisions that I make, you can understand these things from an evolutionary perspective.
For sure. And one last question that I want to leave you with, because I want to be respectful of your time. In what way do you incorporate art and creativity in your life?
Oh, geez. One of the things I love about teaching is I think it gives you opportunity to be endlessly creative. Because how do I take a concept that might seem boring and try to make it interesting and make it memorable to someone? It's like, I don't know if you remember, I tell this joke in class about pollen. Do you remember this joke?
No.
It's a dirty
I
joke.
might.
But,
Let's hear
like trying to explain, how, most people don't understand that trees have sex.
Yeah.
Just like human beings have sex. And that pollen is in essence the equivalent of a tree sperm. And so every time you have hay fever, every time you sneeze, just remember somewhere a tree busted a nut. Right? Now, that is a creative expression of trying to explain that the similarities between us as human beings, as biological creatures, is actually we're surrounded by it. You are surrounded by plant sperm every spring, every time you whiff, but we don't see the world that way because we're often very limited in our perspective. And so one of the things, my goal is, can I get, an understanding of all the things, all these invisible forces that we're surrounded by, that if you just knew about it, you would never forget it. You would never forget every spring you sneezed, oh shoot, there's pollen in the air. There's tree sperm all over
through the
place.
use of humor, which is an intensely creative act.
And so, art, music, if you leave me to my own devices by myself, I will be playing music or making music some way. And so, I think it's one of the joys of being a human being is to be able to make connections that no one else has ever made before.
Yeah.
And that sort of unique thought. This is a thought that no one had before. At least I don't know if anyone had it before. That to me is the joy of life.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, thank you so much for doing what you do and continuing to teach this perspective on evolutionary psychology, this quantum evolutionary psychology perspective at Temple. And where can people find you or learn more about this, or where can I direct people as a result of this podcast?
Unfortunately, at Temple, I keep needing to turn this course into a book and a website. There's things. Somebody actually
YouTube videos.
Yes, a student just this last semester told me I should start a podcast on this stuff. So I do want to get something out there. I was thinking about doing some YouTube videos, and now that I'm going to have a kid, I feel like I'm more inspired to try to leave a legacy.
Yeah.
And so it's on my goal of things to do. Try to figure out a way to get my perspective out there a little bit more. Spread my little mind genes.
Yeah, for sure.
If you repeat any idea that I had, I get to last a little bit longer.
Yeah, you're just a little bit more immortal.
Yeah, exactly. Get my mind genes out there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, until then, people will be able to hear this podcast,
Great.
and I'm glad to get your mind genes out into the gene pool. Thanks again for listening to the Lifting the Iceberg podcast. You can stay up to date on any new podcasts at liftingtheiceberg.com or by following Lifting the Iceberg on Facebook and Instagram. This podcast is also available on Spotify and iTunes. Thank you to Alexa Spaddy for designing the graphics for this podcast. You can find her at alexaspaddy.com. Thank you to Kerusu for the soundtrack Stay With Me. You can find Kerusu on Spotify, YouTube, and Soundcloud.